Good morning. It's a beautiful Sunday morning, the 28th of February of 2021. It's crazy to think we've already gone through 2 months, 2 months already in the new year. A lot has happened, and a lot will continue to happen, I'm sure, throughout this year. We're continuing on in our study in Revelation, and it just hit me. We're halfway through. We've gotten through Revelation 11 and we're starting Revelation chapter 12. And I know that this has been a very quick study, but hopefully it's come to show you that there's a lot to glean from it. There's a lot to learn from it. I know for me personally, it's a lot of things I never studied before, a lot of things I never dove into. A lot of things that I thought were too hard to understand, things that were put quote-unquote too unclear, and that was, very foolish of me. I believe the Bible's meant to be understood. I believe the Bible's out there for us to learn and to glean from, and there may not be things that we might not comprehend fully, but there's things about it we can always understand. It opens up with Revelation, this is my constant reminder, revelation of Jesus Christ. So the book is meant to bring you closer to Him. It's meant to show you more about who God is. We'll see from this chapter specifically a lot that the next part is He sent His angel and sent and signified it in Revelation chapter 1 as well. So we'll see a lot of imagery or metaphors or callbacks to other parts of Scripture in Revelation chapter 12. A lot of things that say, hey, I don't think that this was a physical thing that happened. I do not believe that there was a physical woman that was clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. And I hope that doesn't jar you too much, because it's an image. It's to point you in a direction. It's to show you a sign. It's to give you a clearer picture of the context. Just because it's very descriptive doesn't mean that it was a physical item. It's not a person in history. It's not a person in the future. It's to say, this represents something, so you can turn and say, well, what does it represent? I need to turn and to understand it more. Something else that has been increasingly clear, and it's something that I knew at the beginning of the study, but that's come even more clear, is Revelation is for the Israelites. Revelation is for the Jewish nation. It has connotation and has mentions of the church. It has mentions of me and you, and we're certainly part of it, but it's meant for the Israelites. It's meant for the Jewish nation. It's meant for their understanding of things they've been taught in their history, things they've been prophesied about, or we've talked about in Daniel, and even things from Deuteronomy and Genesis. These are things that have been in a culmination of their past and future that they were led up to believe and led up to study. This is how they learned how to talk. This is how they learned law. This is how they learned their everyday occurrences. It's how they learned to farm. It's how they learned everything. This was their culture. It's all written in the book for us to glean from. So as we go forth into Revelation, we see that there's a lot of times where there's mentions of things that we don't understand, and that don't just immediately say, this is what this means. One of the other biggest parts of Revelation that has been a blessing to me was Revelation has taught me, it was historically was one of the first books distributed to the churches in that area, actually to the regions that it talks about in chapter 2. It is historically one of the first widely divided one, and it taught you how to take this book, took Revelation and said, now I need you to look up other portions of Scripture to understand it. It was teaching the church and teaching everybody who got this copy how to discern Scripture with Scripture, and that's something that's been more apparent to me and a very big blessing for Revelation, because there's things that don't come across as I immediately know what this means. There's things that we'll read that we'll just go, I don't really know what that's talking about. Very specifically, if you go to Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, and it says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, a moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars." If you didn't look anywhere else in Scripture, this wouldn't mean anything else to you. It wouldn't mean anything else to me. It would just show an imagery of some celestial being. But we know when we cross-referenced it to, and I think Matt was the one who brought it up, the Joseph's dream in Genesis 37, and it talks about the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, with Joseph being the 12th, and saying that they're going to bow to each other, and this is the beginning of the Israelite nation. So this helps us understand more of what the context of this is. This woman is Israel. And that's something that I hope I proved to you last week and talked to you, that this woman is mentioned in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah. We see that there's Israel is mentioned as a woman in travail as well in different portions. That this, because of the position and what she's wearing and how she's described. Again, specifically Joseph's dreams, Genesis 37, 9 through 11. For those of you who wanted to know that, I'm not going to go through it again. But we see this beautiful representation of saying this is Israel. This woman represents Israel. And now that she is being with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. So we will come to know that this child is Christ. And so I asked the question who this woman is, and some people answered Mary, some people said Israel, and I can understand that why you would get that, but understanding of what she's wearing and how she's described and what it means in Scripture would make her Israel. And that's why we want to interpret Scripture with Scripture, because otherwise we'll come to these conclusions. It's very easy to say, because the child's Christ, this woman's Mary. And that's not the correct conclusion. That's the easy human reasoning deduction. And that's, I think, another thing that Revelation teaches you, is you can't, I would say Revelation's like algebra. Revelation's a lot like algebra, where you have unknowns and you have to search to find them. But the answer's there. You can deduce it with Scripture. You can find the unknown by going back and saying, well, where does this tie in? How do I know that this is what it says it is? It's because it's in Scripture somewhere else. Now, I would say me and you have a disadvantage. Whereas I know a lot of you have grown up in church and have learned a lot of things. We didn't grow up in Jewish culture. Me and you did not grow up with the Torah. We did not grow up with enveloping yourselves in the Old Testament and learning the laws and specific things. There's a lot of portions of Scripture that we've gone over in Revelation that honestly I had never really read in depth before. I kind of, and I hope you understand what I mean here, but I just read it and didn't think it into anymore. There's a lot of verses that I didn't understand had a deeper meaning, and that's my fault. But Revelation has taught me that the Israelites would know what this meant. When they see that there's a clothed with the sun and the moon and the crown of 12 stars, they would instantly know that this is Israel. They would think of Joseph's dream. They would say, oh, that's where this imagery comes from. So we're seeing that the woman is travailed in birth, and so we'll just quickly read I don't know if I should. Yeah, the whole chapter is actually pretty small. So the first 17 verses of chapter 12, and I might stop here a little bit, because we'll see that this becomes more important, that this is more of a timeline than anything else. It says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads." Again, I don't think there was a physical red dragon. We'll go into more portions of Scripture. I think next week. I don't have too much. I'm trying to gather more information about where the dragon comes, and there's a lot of other references in Revelation in the future about the dragon, but I think that this has a connotation that I'm going to get deeper into, but probably next week. And it said, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and the finished verse 3, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth the man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So we see a lot of things happening here. There's a wide swath of time that is happening in this small first 5 verses of the portion of Scripture. And that we see that this helps us understand that God doesn't perceive time as me and you do. I think that's it's in the Bible. What is it? Days as 1,000 years. It's in there that God doesn't understand time that me and you, or God does understand time like me and you, but God doesn't experience time like me and you. He sees these things in a very compact period. So the tail drawing the third part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. I personally believe, and we'll get more into I have a whole study of the dragon hopefully next week if Kate doesn't arrive, that this is more than likely talking about the separation of the angels of when they were cast down. This is when the angels became demons and they had the choice. Now, timeline-wise, we know that there was demons on the earth before Christ was born, right? I don't think that's too much of a stretch. But this is happening so close together that he says, this happened and then he's ready for her to be delivered. So that in the space from which the demons were cast down and separated and said, they chose who they wanted to choose. And now the angels are there and chose who wanted to choose. Now they said he's poised, waiting for the child to be born. Obviously, this is a wide swath of time. I would say, I don't know how much time was it? Probably over 1,000 years at least, depending on at least the time that the earth was formed. And so now we kind of take a step back and understand that there's this war going on in verse 7. It says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil. Now we learn who the serpent is, that we learn who the dragon is. And Satan, which deceiveth the whole world, he was cast into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now is come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. So in here we see the death. The blood of the Lamb is mentioned. It is overcome because of this. So God's view of Israelites' history, this is the beginning from the sun and the moon, right? From Joseph's dream to right at the beginning of Israel as a nation of the 12 tribes, to now we see the death of Christ here mentioned by the blood of the Lamb. Right? I hope that's not too much of a stretch. The blood of the Lamb is the death of Christ. Hopefully we can all agree on that one. We see that this entire history of the Israelite nation is being played out and showing that what's happening behind the scenes. This is kind of a peek behind the veil of what God is seeing. And he's letting them into it and saying that there has been so much care that's gone into this. There's been so much forethought. There's been so much protection. There's been so much danger that I've kept you from up until this point. That there's a dragon literally waiting to devour you as a nation, right? I think the purpose of Revelation chapter 9 as a whole, or chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12 as a whole, is him giving a peek of, this is what I've been doing for your entire life. For your entire length of the nation, for your entire view, for your entire historical existence. This is what I've been doing for you. This is what's happened before. I've recognized who you are and the danger that you've encountered because I've chosen you. And this is what I've protected you from. I did not let the dragon devour you. there was actual like war happening in heaven for your life, for your, this battle of saying, these are things that we've cared about. It's interesting that Revelation 12 comes now. That it almost seems like it's a pause chapter. And we've seen a couple of those as well. It's one where he takes a step back and gives an explanation of things. So this one I can kind of compare it to the one where John eats the book and is explained that this is kind of another chapter where it pauses and says, let's talk about something. Let me show you the greater picture. Because the entirety of the beginning of this chapter in Revelation chapter 8 and beyond has been kind of bleak for Israel. There's a lot of mention of especially Revelation 11 has been mentioning a lot of portions that's saying, you've let the temple has been pretty much defiled because the court has been given to the unbelieving. It's trodden underfoot. You have been not focused on me. You haven't rejected me. It took the death of my prophets for you to even understand who I was. We saw that at the end of chapter 11. It took all this travesty and travail for you to even acknowledge that I'm supposed to be the one to rule you. That this beautiful representation of a woman who's sun and moon and stars, this what is supposed to be a beautiful thing in the perfect time period. We know that it didn't happen on their time. He was supposed to come and rule all nations. Again, I'm not making that up. It's in verse 5. Who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. He's saying this is what was supposed to happen. I was giving you this opportunity. And I protected you from Satan. I gave you the opportunity to do what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to thrive because of what I was giving you. You were supposed to become the nation that I wanted you to become. And now we have this step back and saying, let me just show you what you are to me. This beautiful representation of, this is your history in a form, the things that you can understand. Verses 12 through 17, we'll talk a little bit about that, and we're going to definitely get deeper into the dragon next week. I wasn't able to fully get as much as I wanted to study. I have a lot written down, but just not a complete thought, so I didn't want to go halfway into it. I like to try to get my point across if I can. And we're seeing that the overcoming by the blood of the Lamb, and now we're seeing this rejoicing that's happening in verse 12. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down to you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. When the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. We see him he wasn't able to stop it from happening, so now he's going to persecute Israel. Again, God allowed this to happen, but he's saying this is what happened. The devil was so mad, he's like, I'm just going to persecute the woman. This, again, would say that another portion that would say that I don't believe it's Mary, because I don't really see in history that she had much persecution. But that's just another kind of aside. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So there's another portion of Scripture that mentions, there's a specific mention of, in verse 14, the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and a half a time from the face of the serpent. Repetition and variation is important in Scripture. If it says something more than once, or says the same thing in a different way, it's a way to get you to look at it and to delve into it more. That's just, I think, speaking from the beginning of time. If something's repeated, it's usually important. If you ever take a class and a teacher says something more than once, it's probably going to be on the test. It's one of those things where it's to draw attention to this. So my question is, where is this time, times, and half of times mentioned before? Where is this time, times, and half of times? Why is this? This seems to come out of nowhere. Of what he's trying to draw this into. He's like, where is this kind of fit in with each other? It's talking about the tribulation period, but time, times, and half of times is mentioned somewhere else in the Bible. It's Daniel. Daniel chapter, and I want to make sure I get this right before I say it, Daniel chapter 7. Hopefully this gives you a greater appreciation for who Daniel was. It really has opened my eyes to how important Daniel as a figurehead or as a prophesying mouth for Israel is. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25. I believe. Yes. And he says, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and to think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and a dividing of time." So a half of times. So we see this mention of this interesting series of words, and then also if you read verse 24, there's mention of 10 horns as well. That's again going to be part of the study of the dragon as well. But we see this beautiful separation. So if we say time, times, and a half of time, there would be time, 7 years. Sorry, I'm messing this up. Hold on. Let me make sure. Time, 7 years, times, multiple, and a half of time of 3.5. So we see that they're having this beautiful callback or even call forward into the how the math fits into the 70th week of Daniel. Half of times being 3.5 years. Time would be 1 year. Or time 1 week. Time 7 times multiples of 7. Half of time 3.5 years. Yeah. So it's basically time, and the times specifically can be any number amount. I am taking it to be probably the
1 year, so 1 year, and then a half a year, so you have 3.5 years.
Maybe that one's right too, because I was taking half of times of half a week, but that could be as well as, and that's kind of where I was trying to keep it in line with how Daniel interprets it. But that's
times would be 2 years. Yeah. Time is
1 year.
Times is 2.
3.5 years. That also could be. I think the math works out either way. I was just trying to keep it with the periods of sevens, but also the time 1 year times 2 years and a half of times for 3.5 total years also could be, I think, completely correct. I guess I never thought of it the way that my dad was mentioning it, but I definitely have been wrong before, and luckily my wife is out of the room to not hear that. So we see this mention and bringing back into Daniel that the culmination of the end, and we'll go into Daniel chapter 7 a little bit more, talking about the dragon and the beasts, and there's a lot of prophecy in Daniel, and I hope that that's going to become more in picture for us as we go forth and start to learn more about the dragon. There's mentions of the dragon before, and the 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, and this will be very, I think, beautiful of what it really means and what it represents, and why does he look like this? What is that trying to connotate and things like that? So that's, I think that's a good stopping point as we'll try to learn more about the dragon next year. next week as we look at that and see what does this mean to us and what does this mean to Israel. And they should understand this connotation. Just because we don't right off the bat doesn't mean that they didn't. This, again, has been pretty clear to me. But John, if you don't mind closing us in prayer this week.
Father, we thank you for this day that we come and worship you. We pray for the prayer request of the day this day. We thank you for the teaching and ask for